So, without further ado, let me introduce you to Lydia Pang first. Now, Lydia is what she self-describes, I hope, as a Frankenstein creative, which I really love. And she might even talk a little bit about that, with a decade of experience in mission-driven marketing. And she's currently overseeing brand narrative at Nike Sportswear. And Lydia is going to take the side of practice. So it sounds like, Lydia, you've got a bit of an easy ride here, but hey ho, let's see how we go. And with everything to play for, Ty, we have Professor Tyrone Drake, who joins us. He is the Professor of Graphic Design at the Art Center College of Design at California. And Ty has over 20 years of experience in creative industry and is speaking today, I suppose maybe as we might expect, on theory. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. This is going to be really fascinating. And I think also, you know, at a time when, you know, it is an extraordinary time right now for people coming into the industry. And so, you know, this is a very practical discussion, I think, which will hopefully shine a light on really how people go forward as they make the transition from education into industry. So to start us off, I'm going to pass over to Lydia, who's got the stage for 5 to 10 minutes. Over to you.
I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see. Can you guys see? Just give me a gentle nod. Yes?
Yes.
Sweet.
We've got your screen.
Okay, great. I'm going to just get rid of your faces so I'm not distracted.
And it's looking gorgeous.
Okay. This is so fun. Okay, so hi everyone. I'm really excited to get stuck into unpacking practice and why, in my eyes, practice makes imperfect. First off, I'm Lydia. I'm originally from Wales. I'm a creative at Nike. I'm an old emo living in Portland, Oregon. So I kind of want to set the stage for why practice. So this slide kind of represents my day one after graduation existential crisis upon entering my career. My whole career, I've been constantly shoved into lots of little boxes, you know, as if it's not hard enough being a, you know, often the only woman or person of color in a room. They would ask me, so are you a strategist, or are you a designer, or are you a writer? And, you know, I think a lot of the people that hired me and worked with me did this to make sense of me, to try and know how to brief me, or, you know, if they were to hire me, or how to bill me to clients. You know, they wanted me neat and tidy in a craft silo and in a box. And this sparked like major imposter syndrome for me, like day one. I wasn't the best at any of these things. And to be honest, I didn't want to be the best. And, you know, to any fellow Asians watching right now, that was very painful for me. I thought this industry was about innovation and vision and disruption. And I kind of felt like day one, I'd already failed. But I just want to take a little, like tip my hat a little bit to theory, because I actually did an art history degree. So I have an enormous respect for theory. And I'm super nerdy about dissecting imagery and semiotics and author-subject gaze. It's like very much my bag. It's a John Berger image in the background. But after many, many years of this torture, I realized that the key to my career was basically ignoring almost everything that I'd been taught, and that the real lessons were happening along the way. The adaptability, learning on the go, zero ego, emotional intelligence, and willingness to try and fail, those instincts. Every year of my career, I pretty much added a new facet to my skill set, and I sort of practiced being this shapeshifter. And I do believe that creativity should sit at the intersection of many crafts. So, you know, integrated thinking, holistic solutions, audience-driven, not format-driven. And I think to make great work, we must burn that box. Just to skip back like a few steps and kind of a decade, actually my creativity was born out of practice and muddling through. I think, as you can imagine, Wales wasn't exactly brimming with inspiration. And so I spent my whole like teenage years on MySpace, and, you know, I started by playing with design and hacking HTML and self-branding and editing images and crafting narratives. And, You know, as a teenage emo, this MySpace showed me that I could contribute to and shape culture, even in Wales. So my belief system was really born out of a spirit of jumping in and giving it a go. And I do believe that we as storytellers, all of us, have an enormous responsibility to fill the world with meaningful messages that unite and shift thinking. And I think the reality is we all just want to feel something. So I started making personal work that made me feel something. I co-founded a rape crisis initiative with some friends, and we commissioned the very male lens fashion photographer Peru, who shot these images of girls in Shoreditch on their way out for the night. And the premise of the campaign was that an outfit can't give consent, clothing can't speak, a red lip or a skirt can't say yes. And we got loads of press. And victims reached out thanking us, and we did something that helped people dispel the myth around consent, you know, with zero budget or help or frankly any experience, and it felt amazing. And so after that, I kind of got an appetite for more like disruptive messaging, and I started really pushing against what agencies would let me do. In this campaign for List, we riffed off the tropes of fashion and how it had oppressed women historically. And, you know, this is a fashion campaign kind of mocking itself, very self-aware. And with this client, I suddenly learned about influencer activations and media partnerships and seeding and experiential and stuff that I didn't really know about at all. And I jumped in and I kind of figured it out. And so a big facet of practice, I would say, is you must keep making stuff. So this is one thing I do constantly. I'm always making personal work. I'm always practicing my beliefs alongside my day job. This is an example of that. This is a film that we did for Elle magazine. In partnership with Alex Holder, we retouched men out of iconic images to make the point there was more room for women at the top. And I think it's important to note this work isn't craft perfection. It's not good or bad design. It's just a sharp insight. It's cultural context. It was turned around in a few weeks. It's about understanding the audience and playing with irony and satire. So I never stopped practicing and finding new creative facets to keep burning that box. I was almost like I had to keep proving to myself that I was on the right path. And I think by practicing and working so much, it made me, that kind of answered it for me. It answered a lot of it and it resolved it for me. So this is a project I did about a year or so ago, all about recycling dead flowers. So I set myself a challenge to set up, brand, and turn a profit in a month. That's how I like to relax, apparently. I decided to try and become an agent. So I started representing Maisie Cousins, an amazing photographer and artist who I met on Instagram. I just slid into her DMs and was like, hey, do you want to hang out and partner? And we did shows at the Tate and features for Dazed and Vogue. And we even shot Bjork. And this is actually a personal project I'm working on right now. I was literally working on it yesterday. And it's a recipe zine called Eat Bitter. And it's a series of recipes from my childhood, basically told through stories, because, you know, why not? And out of all of this practice over the years, embracing the growth, leaning into change, and kind of trying new things that I don't really know a lot about, I began to really form my own perspective around things, around stuff like gender and style and why, you know, eyebrow pencils can be feminist. And then I started at Refinery 29, a feminist media company, and I made some really fun work. And I was really able to intersect my personal beliefs and activism with my day job. And that was a big unlock for me, kind of being hired for my opinion. And this was my very first day at Nike headquarters in Portland. And let me be very clear, I did not get this job because I am the best designer, best writer, best art director, or like coolest person. I feel like everyone that works for Nike is super cool. I'm none of those things, but I do have a built set of beliefs and opinions and ways of working that pushes the creative into a new space and that is really good at identifying the enemy and getting that job done, embracing the change, and isn't really, you know, I'm not afraid to have the tough conversations. I've built my career on that. And so what started as a fragility and an imposter syndrome became my superpower. And now being imperfect but practiced is why I get hired. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is maybe it's about graft and not craft, because it was graft and agility and adaptability that got me my pencils, my global roles, my most fulfilling work. And I'm okay, you know, to look you all in the Zoom eye right now, speaking on design and art direction panel, and say that I'm not a craft expert at any of those things. I'm not excellent really at anything, but I get my hands dirty and I try and I fail and I pivot. And when I've tried to exist within a framework to squeeze myself into that box, which I've done over the years, I have made quite vanilla work and I felt quite small. But when I did burn the box and pushed into my own space, I felt like my career really, really began. Thanks.
Lydia, thank you. I was so enthralled, I sort of stopped taking notes. So that means the discussion is going to be interesting. So let's go straight over to Ty for him to have a debate and discussion on the side of theory.
So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar on theory versus practice. So I'm going to try to put this into the context of time periods and give you an idea of what I call sort of revolutions in typography. I mean, I teach typography and graphic design at Art Center College of Design. So, but I'm going to talk about, and I also went to school at Art Center. So I'm going to talk about time periods and how it relates to this idea of theory versus practice, because when I was at Art Center and I graduated Art Center in the 90s, I'm going to show you what was happening during the 90s. And some of you guys will probably know this and understand this, but in the 90s when I was a student at Art Center, there was this sort of revolution in the way typography and graphic design was being done. So this is kind of the work that I was seeing when I was a student at Art Center, right? This sort of really organic, this is the work of April Bryman right now. So this really organic, very, non-traditional use of typography and graphic design as it relates to the invention of the Macintosh computer. So April Bryman basically was doing this stuff and using the Mac as a tool when it first came out, and you can see some of that influence in the work that she shows here, right? So going from April Bryman into David Carson, when I was a student at Art Center, I was taking classes that, and if anybody knows anything about Art Center's methodology and pedagogy in terms of its teaching philosophy has its roots in Bauhaus, European and Swiss graphic design and typography, which is really, really traditional, right? So when I was at Art Center, we were being taught this sort of European, Swiss, Bauhaus ideal of form follows function, but what we were seeing in the design of the stuff that we weren't seeing in school, and actually designers from around the world, we were seeing this sort of the use of typography and these really, really organic, non-traditional uses of letter forms, right? So I'm going to keep this in the context of a lot of typography as well, and graphic design, but typography mostly because I teach a lot of that. So this is what I went to school seeing when I was at Art Center. And consequently, this resonated with me, because for me, coming from where I came from in an environment which was it was very political and a lot of social, political and activism going on, this made sense to us. We connected with this sort of really organic, non-traditional way of doing and making, right? So as you can see with David Carson, and then getting into Scott Michaela, this idea of non-traditional ways of communicating narrative, right, and branding. So this is what I grew up looking at. And then we get into Von Oliver, which most of you guys will probably know. And Von Oliver was probably one of the people that, when I was at Art Center, who I really, really loved the work, because I think he put a combination of both that idea of organic theory and practice together. And a lot of the work that he did actually shows that. So very organic in his use of visual vernacular and visual language, but more traditional in his use of some of the typography, meaning, and I'll show you some more of that a little bit later. So again, this idea of theory versus practice, when I was at Art Center, for me, it was all about practice. But I'm going to show you what happens, what happened to me in terms of how I put so much emphasis on the idea of organic and theory versus, practice versus theory, and some of the work that I did later on. So the idea of non-traditional and organic visual making, and the idea of practice without having necessarily to be very, very traditional, had its place for me at that time. So what happened when I left Art Center, I ended up becoming the art director at the School of Architecture at USC. And I took this sort of visual language with me when I left Art Center and got my first job at USC at the School of Architecture. And the work that I was doing there had this sort of visual language associated with it. And I'll show you some of that work that I did there. And what happened with me is I was at the School of Architecture for 6 years, and I came out of Art Center with this sort of visual language and this idea of the 90s, right? And what happened was I got into a lot of fights with the dean of the School of Architecture, because he couldn't understand why I was designing in this way and why I was not making the content more accessible to the viewer. Now, this is really important to understand, theory versus practice, right? The idea of narrative and storytelling, for me, I thought it was all visual, and that's why I would design this way. And so for me, this made sense to me because it felt intuitive, but it wasn't as controlled, right? So what I did was I was using these really aggressive shapes and this really aggressive visual vernacular. And for me, it caused a lot of problems for me being there, because the dean of the School of Architecture couldn't understand why I was doing this. And so this is some of the examples of some of the work that I was doing. I showed you that earlier. So for me, this idea of organic nature, really sort of trying to decide how I'm going to communicate information, got kind of lost in the idea of accessibility, right? So narrative and storytelling is about accessibility. And so basically what happened was, eventually I had to come back to understanding the rules, right? And understanding how to take the idea of theory and putting it into, this idea of practice. How do you combine both of them in order for your audience to understand the content? So what I ended up doing later on is I came back to Art Center to teach. I was asked to come back to Art Center to teach in the graphic design department. And what I ended up doing was I ended up teaching a class in which I actually was a student in when I was at Art Center. It was called Typography 2 Structure. And so what I ended up having to do was going back to school and learning a lot of the basics. And this is going back to the beginnings of typography. So this is the idea of theory. The idea of form follows function, understanding grid structure, understanding hierarchy, understanding the idea of content, and allowing accessibility. So what you're seeing here is, these are samples from one of my Typography 2 Structure classes at Art Center, and this is student work. And the idea of teaching students, and before you can break the rules, you should learn the rules first, which we're going to get back to in this debate, obviously. So what you see here is examples of allowing and teaching students the formality of typography. What's important as far as communication and narrative is concerned, right? So, but that's one thing. So when you're at your very basic, what we call your foundation studies at Art Center, the idea of foundation studies teaches you the basics of things, right? So one of the things that we do, and I do in my class, is, okay, let's teach you how to follow the rules first, and then we'll show you how to break those rules. So these are all some samples of the Typography 2 Structure class, which also is really related to the idea of following the rules of typography and structure and narrative. And then what I'm going to do is, so within that same idea, those same students later on, so I use this typographic morphology and to give students the idea of how they can break out of the rules. So once you learn the rules, then how do you take the idea of that methodology, and how do you take it into practice and actually break out of those without necessarily losing control over the content? So what I use is a typographic morphology, and allow students to take the idea of structure, but also use some structure, but to break out of it. And so these are examples of that morphology, and allowing you this idea of breaking out of the rules of typography to give you a lot more freedom, right? So this idea of learning the rules and breaking the rules are all taught pretty much in the same class. So, and the reason why I do this is because I talk to my students about the 90s all the time, and the example that I went through of going through this whole idea of working for someone and bringing this visual vernacular with me, and not being able to have it work so much as far as accessibility was concerned. And consequently, what happened to me at USC School of Architecture is I got fired. There's nothing better, there's no better learning experience than being fired from a job and understanding the reason why. So the idea of theory versus practice is to me, I think at some point is combining both. But this is the idea of how it's important to actually understand both and learn both in the classroom. So I'd like to do this in my classes so I can teach my students early on that theory has its place, right? And you can let that lock you in, or it can also free you once you actually learn those rules. So that's an example of all of that theory and how I teach that at Art Center. That's it. Kate, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. So I think, I mean, it's as I say, I sort of had a very strange thing. My son's school just rang midway through that, so that doesn't usually happen in one of these sessions. So I lost everyone for a second. But what I found fascinating as I sort of heard you, first of all, I found it enthralling looking at that work, but I thought it was really interesting because both of you talk about, you know, your instinct was to, in a way, break out. And initially, both kind of didn't want to quite follow the rules. And I thought it was interesting, Ty, when you sort of said you suddenly realized, you know, there was a value in going, okay, so I've now moved so far away, I've kind of not allowing people into my work. Right. And that was a moment where actually that was back to some theory, some best practice. I thought that was fascinating when you said that. Right.
So I think as designers, we're intuitive. I mean, as designers and artists, I think for the most part, we're instinctual, right? We design instinctually. And we design about things that we feel. And it's okay to do that. But we don't design for ourselves. What took me a while to learn is that I'm not designing for myself. There's an audience that I'm communicating to. If the audience is not, if the information and the narrative and the story is not accessible, if I'm only designing for myself, I'm not making it accessible to the end user. And it took me, that was a hard lesson for me to learn, but it was a good one for me to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. I mean, it's something, you know, it's taken me many, many decades to learn. But I mean, it's a very interesting journey when you can, you know, walk in other people's shoes, as it were, to understand. But Lydia, what I love about your story was actually, and I think this is, I don't know if I'm going off the subject here, but whatever, I found it fascinating, was actually you suddenly felt that you said big as opposed to small when you put yourself into your work. And actually, I really loved what you were sort of saying, that you said that you were hired for your opinion, you know, and actually that was a really liberating moment because, you know, you felt that actually your style of creative came from a purpose that you were obviously exploring sort of right from the beginning. But I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I completely agree with everything that Ty just said. And it's interesting because there's so much, this conversation is going to do this, where we're like, yeah, but what you said makes sense. But I do think that, like, thinking about like audience, and I said that in my presentation too, audience driven, insight driven. It just so happens that I focused on work where I can relate specifically to the audience. And I think I've really leaned into that. I was a reader of Refinery 29 before I worked there. I'm obviously a consumer of Nike products, and I find it, you know, inspiring the way that we get after mission-driven work. And so that's why I'm at Nike now. So it has made it so that my career moves and choices have been much more focused. There are certain places that I don't feel like I could work. They wouldn't want to know my opinion. Maybe it wouldn't be relevant to them. But so I've definitely centered my practice on like insight driven, and I've definitely put myself at the center of it because I know that. I know how to make on that. I don't know what the longevity looks like on that, but that's how I've rolled for the last 10 years. So
But I think, I mean, I think it's about, you know, people finding their voice,
Yeah.
and bringing some of themselves to their type of creativity. And I think that was really interesting, Ty, as well. You said, you know, at a time when people weren't doing that kind of organic work,
Right.
because of the, you know, because of what you've been inspired by, you kind of brought that to something that, you know, it's something that that wasn't the norm at the time, you know.
Yeah, I you know, the idea of personal voice, which you just talked about. I mean, when I was practicing and learning, actually, when I was learning graphic design at that time was all about voice. You know, I mean, I think about in terms of time periods. I mean, to me, the 90s was the last sort of revolution in the way typography and graphic design was being done. Before that, I go back to the futurism and the futurists, right? And Marinetti and his band of Italians, right? And the work that they were doing to break out of this idea of, no, we're anti-establishment, we're anti, you know, government, right? We want to communicate and create a whole new way of communicating to people. And this idea of what the future is like and how we actually sort of relate to each other. So for me, when I came out of Art Center, I had this toolbox of like, okay, I'm going to go and set the world on fire.
Yeah.
And because of what I was seeing. And when I got that, it was kind of a stark, like, you know, eye-opening experience for me to think that I was going to do that.
Yeah.
And then roll up against this brick wall and go, wait a minute, you need to understand that in order for you to be really good at what you do, you have to understand how to communicate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what was, so would you say, you know, having your voice and opinion, you know, both of you, do you feel that you, in a way, in order to break the rules, do you feel that you need to know the rules to start with to break the rules? And I think, Ty, that your story demonstrates that in a way.
Well, I don't want to take up too much screen time. I'll let Hillary answer that first, and then I'll come back.
Well, I think I would.
Lydia, I'm sorry.
Lydia,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Lydia's perspective.
I don't think that, but that's only because of my personal experience. I mean, like I said, I studied history of art. I have a massive respect for like theoretical frameworks. I apply them every day. I think theoretically, and I have respect for people who are able to approach work like that. It's almost like I just know I'm not that person. And I think it took me a little while to realize that. And I tried to be that person. And then I realized that I'm not that good at that stuff. I'm not. And my value add is that insight and is that, you know, bringing that relevancy and understanding culture and my opinion. And that's a really hard thing to insert yourself in a meeting room when you're like 21 and be like, no, I'm here for my opinion. Like, that's not how that works. And so I had to spend a lot of years trying to kind of be an art director shape. And then I was like, okay, I'll be a copywriter shape. And the fact is, like, my insight always won. And so I think it's important to note too, that I was obviously like a person in a room that you know, in that room, I was the minority. And so I do think there's something to be said for the fact that I was able to reclaim a lot of those narratives around the female experience. And that I think is important to note, because obviously that's where the opportunity arose, frankly, like being the one of two women in a massive creative department in a huge ad agency in London was both difficult, but also you knew what briefs you were going to get put on. And those were your opportunities to shine and to say something in a room that no one else could feel because they didn't identify with that experience. And so I've definitely wielded that vulnerability as my power, I would say.
Yeah.
And so, and for me, what I'll say is that, you know, it's not one thing fits everyone. I think that, you know, some creatives have this just power that they want, and this instinct to follow their creative, you know, vision, and that's totally fine to do. When I was when I got into graphic design, when I started studying at Art Center, I didn't want my work to look like anyone else's work. I always, because that instinct for me as a child, as a kid growing up in Oakland, California, where I grew up, was all about being different from everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. And so the idea of being a practitioner and finding my own voice. I had my own voice before I got to Art Center, but and I think what happens is the idea of theory can do two things. Like I said, one, it can box you in. What you can see, what happens quite often is with theory is that you get this sort of formulaic the visual vernacular that happens quite often. You see there's no separation between one's work from another person's work. However, in let's say retail or branding and things of that nature, that may be fine. But when you get to, let's say, doing music, for example, and that's what made Von Oliver's work so damn good, is that Von could take the idea of theory and practice, put those two things together and create this whole vernacular that allowed the viewer to be accessible, but also give it this really distinct feeling.
Yeah.
And to me, that's what's really important. And that's what I try to teach my students as well. I want you to learn this first and then break out of it when you're ready to.
Yeah.
It's interesting, sorry to jump in, but it's interesting that because I do agree with that. And there are moments, there have been junctures where I feel like I've identified with that. I think my craft or my learning has come from the willingness to keep learning new things. And so instead of, focusing a period of time on the depth of one craft, I've tried to jump between a lot of things. Like I did one thing around like floral design, and then now I'm writing a book about recipes. I don't know, I can't cook. It's like this willingness to approach a theoretical framework and a thing you don't know, and to like put yourself into that craft with all your vulnerability and kind of muddle through. Yeah. That's the thing I like. So I do like that feeling of like constant learning.
Yeah, and that was going to be my sort of just final question or prompt before we move on to some questions that are coming in. But, I think there is such an opportunity to do very much what you did, Lydia, which was you kind of, like you say, you try stuff, your own projects, but actually you go, right now, I thought this was cool. I'm just going to try it and I'm going to put it out there. And I think probably now more than any time, there are opportunities for people to do that. They don't have to be, projects that with them come, written briefs. They can be things that you see an opportunity, you want to try something out, and actually not being afraid of failure, just giving it a go. And I think, I think opportunity to do a social thing, to post it somewhere, to do something. There are huge opportunities to try stuff out. Yeah. And I think that's really exciting. Right. I have a question, and I think this is something I was going to ask this question. So I'm not going to ask it because I have someone who's actually asking it rather than me asking it. So given that, I'm going to read it. So given the current climate, it's become amply clear that what most of us have been taught or learnt might have problematic roots. How can the current trends in practice actively uphold the need for active learning and unlearning? So I suppose this is really saying right now, here today, people are feeling that maybe what they've learnt isn't quite relevant because they're being thrown into a different situation. I don't know what you think about that. Give us a...
Let me jump in on that one because, I've been following a lot of protests, obviously with the whole Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States and around the world. I feel like as a practitioner, as a graphic designer, and Milton Glaser, who rest in peace, who just died, he made the statement about designers and social responsibility, right? That you owe it to yourself and you owe it to practice that. I think as a designer who went to school at a formal institution that has its roots in Swiss typography and Bauhaus methodology, I have the ability to take my skill sets and communicate to audiences about what I may feel. So everybody has a story to tell. Everybody wants to say something. Everybody has something that they want to say. So I think, it's not so much that what we learn is bad and it can't be used for good now. It's just the way you use it, right? Yeah. So for me, typography is what language looks like. So if I'm a good typographer and I need to communicate and I want that communication to be accessible, I have the ability, because of what I learned, in order to put that into a context, but do it in my own voice to make it even more powerful.
Yeah, yeah. Right. This is a really practical question, which I think probably students all over the world are going to ask, which is, in the lockdown, my internship has been cancelled.
Yeah.
So should I do further study, or should I try and get some hands-on experience?
Lydia, you go for it first. Lydia, you go first. I'm taking too much time. Lydia, you go first.
Well, I think I know Lydia's answer.
Yeah, I would use the momentum and the opportunity and right now to redefine the type of career you want to have. And I think it is a privilege to have the time to explore your creativity. I think study is obviously an important and interesting route. I would encourage you to think outside of extending study you've already done. Like what new facets can you gain to add to, who you are? I think that's the thing that's going to make people stand out. I think also this is a time where, to Ty's point, what you know and what you've learned thus far and what you feel, this is an opportunity to create something, to respond to that. And I don't think, to kind of double answer the question earlier too, I don't think we should be looking back thinking, oh, I learned a load of stuff and that's not relevant now. Like, everything that's happened to you up to this culminating point is relevant. Your awareness of some of the things that you need to be educate yourself around or unlearn, or the ways that you want to approach your work now that this new cultural context is here, that's just amazing fuel for you to create work that you would never have made a year ago. What an amazing opportunity. I've been thinking a lot about, a couple of years ago, that, the day after the election announcement with Trump, I went to a Ryan McGinley and Marilyn Minter talk. It was the day after, and it was the strangest talk. Like, I thought it was going to be about art and their experiences, and then obviously the whole thing turned into a dialogue around, oh my God, Trump has been elected. And what was so beautiful and interesting was the culminating point of that entire thing gave me so much comfort, and I think about it a lot. Ryan McGinley was like, wait, we are in like crisis and chaos. We are like as emotionally raw as we could be. We've got all of these skills, and now we're going to make some amazing art. And I feel like what an exciting proposition to be given the time and a context that's so challenging to really feel something and make something out of that. And so that's what I would encourage you to do, is to make some things and to be to be kind of nimble with it, like test and learn things, like give things a go. That's what I would do. Yeah.
And for me, Lydia, that was great. I mean, I totally agree with that. And I think that this idea of where we are in our society right now is like, I mean, digitally, we're experiencing sort of digital burnout. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so I encourage everyone, and this is what I used to do for myself: make projects for yourself. Right? Pick things that you're really passionate about and create projects for yourself and explore. Go back to things that are analog. Go back to making, right? I mean, I'm not saying that we'll get to the technology thing in a second, because I think she's going to ask a question about that. But this idea of technology and how it influences what happens in design and in culture, that's fine. But right now, because we're all spending so much time on technology and looking at screens, that going back to just making analog with your hands, printing, making type by hand, and just creating projects that way, I think for one thing, I think it's much more therapeutic. Then the other thing I think is the idea is that you allow yourself to do things that you're passionate about, and you can get away from this idea that you have to be so 100% on point all the time. You know what I mean? And you have to be like you're performing all the time. You don't have to feel that way. Go back to just making.
I completely agree with that. Also, my last couple of projects were almost a response to the fact that I was working in digital media, and I did floral design, so I could touch something with my hands. And, you know, now I'm working on a zine, and I'm cooking, and I'm figuring out the design, and I'm drawing, and I can't draw. Like, I'm just trying to, like, to your point, like getting back to that tactility. And I think it's important to note from a practical, I feel like we're both speaking from positions of like, explore yourself. And that's kind of annoying because you're like, okay, thanks. But, you know, practically speaking, I have got all of my most significant roles through showcasing work that was done in my own time. When I interviewed for a refinery, they asked me to show 3 case studies of work that I'd done before. I showed them 3 personal projects. You know, when I interviewed at Nike and there was that scary room with a big panel of people, you know, they weren't interested in my commercial work. They were interested in the work that reflected who I was. And to your point, Ty, like, you know, work that is about you, work that you can make right now.
That's right. And, you know, and a lot of people, there will be a lot of companies and organizations or whatever that will hire you because they want you to fit into their vernacular. But then there's also the other side of it where people are hiring you for what you bring to their narrative. Yeah, and so I think you got to look at it from both standpoints.
I think I think that's fascinating, and I couldn't agree more. I think you want to get a sense of the person, because you want, you know, I always talk about the people that you're working with and collaborating with. You want it to be have bench strength of difference. And you only have that if you bring yourself to the party, your unique experiences, your unique backgrounds, and that could be from your learning, it could be from your practice. But I think that's important. So I'm going to wrap up the session now, because I think we've reached that time. We're going to take a little. I'd love everyone to look at that poll again and see. Here it is on the screen. So if we could. Click practice or theory, see if anyone has, you know, if there's any swing voters there, that would be fabulous.
Hopefully I influence some people to pick theory a little bit more.
So let's see what happens with that. I don't know, I think that's, well,
a little bit better.
Yes.
Oh man. Lydia, you kicked ass.
You made it a fair world. I love that. It's
so
true.
You managed to move the needle a little bit on the theory.
Yes.
Which is great, because I think actually, you know, as everyone's talking, have we run out of time? I'm going to finish. I think Hillary will tell me if I just finish or not, but finish the poll and thank everyone. I'd love to thank Lydia. I would love to thank Tyrone for being fabulous on the discussion. It was absolutely great. And I love the insights from both of you, because I think all of us have learned, and there were so many questions that I think everyone would have loved. We just didn't have time to answer. But I think that's given real insight to everyone.
Kate, you are a fabulous moderator. You are a fabulous moderator. Let's start our hair band.
We're starting a hair band. That's exactly what we're doing. We're loving it. I think hopefully maybe the other ones will go a bit more smoothly, but this was the first and therefore the best.